careful, please. That elite was an ultra.
Is Mormonism an ancient Sumerian fertility cult that worships the god Idim, or Idim, that worships the god Ea? That is the question for today. And the inspiration for this comes from this article that I actually recently read. Two of them, actually. One of them's a little shorter and more readable. So that's the one we're going to be focusing on today. And it's by a guy named Sad D. Abulhab. I believe he is a Muslim. And this is an article that was published at the City University of New York, aka CUNY, which is very unfortunate. But anyway, so I'm just going to read a bunch of it, and then we'll talk, because, I mean, obviously you know what I think, but what does this guy who's not a member of our faith think about Adam? So it says, Adam in the early Mesopotamian creation mythology. The hypothesis of a creation of an initial single human from scratch is the central thematic and philosophical element of monotheism. Whether it was created in Mesopotamia or elsewhere, it embodies the fundamental tenets of the monotheistic concept of creation and supreme creator. It explains the nature of the first created human and the destiny of humanity. It determines the roots of punishments and rewards in relation to the one God. Whether the first human was created from scratch or by supreme intelligence or evolved naturally characterizes the validity of human awareness and the essence and order of intelligence itself. Singling out ancient Mesopotamia for this study is crucial, since today the term monotheism became synonym to the so-called Abrahamic monotheism of the three major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are believed to be originated from that area. Although the Hebrew Old Testament does not seem to be the sole monotheist source consulted for the topic of human creation in Islam and Christianity, it should nonetheless be the key one to examine because it was the earliest one. Modern readings in the literary work of ancient Mesopotamia, comprising modern Iraq and most of Syria today, indicate that the story of the first monotheist human, Adam, shares key details with several stories of the ancient literature. The nature of the first human was neither clear nor consistent in both. However, the struggle between good and evil and the contrast of death and eternal life were the main hallmarks of all these stories. When taking into account that these ancient folktales were circulated for thousands of years, matching the exact identical name of the first human, Adam, becomes less important, and not the only definitive factor to trace back his story, particularly since all the names used for the major characters in these time periods, gods, humans, or mixed beings, were methodological descriptive names or nicknames rather than actual names. According to the inscriptions, most of these characters were referred to by different names in various historical time periods and/or geographical localities. In this study, several ancient stories will be examined to understand the nature of the first human and the mythological settings surrounding his creation, and to extract any possible linkages to the prevailing modern story of Adam. Most emphasis will be on similarities and common elements between these stories as evident through various readings of inscriptions and manuscripts. Translations that are primarily based on actual historical dictionaries, like the old etymological Arabic references, are crucial to arrive to the correct readings. In all of these stories, one should concentrate on their three main narrative elements: the nature of the initial first human, his immortality status, and the events shaping the outcomes. One should also keep in mind the fact that while many prehistoric ancient stories have survived, none have ever been retold intact. Different versions of identical ancient stories were likely introduced over the centuries and millenniums after being influenced by the unique factors of specific geographical locations and historical periods. There are three key elements in the monotheist story of Adam. First, he was initially a divine creature created from scratch by God, in terms of blood, look, and immortality status. Second, his immortality status was threatened by unintentional and uncontrolled circumstances. Third, these circumstances involved an open conflict between good and evil forces. As for the first element, Hebrew Genesis was solidly clear that Adam was not only created with the blood of a god, but he also had the look and feel of a god. Current translations of line 126 in Genesis claim it said, "Let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness." However, while the first relevant Hebrew word in the line, you're going to have to forgive me for all this gobbledygook pronunciations, in the line bisalamanu correctly meant in our image, the second word, kadamutnu, could not have meant as our likeness. Surely the word damyatu can mean image in Old Arabic and Hebrew, and one can hypothesize it could also mean likeness. But using two words with identical meanings after each other would be an unneeded repetition. This word was clearly related to the root Arabic words damu and dama, meaning blood. Therefore, kadam wutnu can either mean as our blood or as a piece of our blood. Similarly, the phrase bidamut ihim sa'atu in line 5.1 meant with the blood of God he made him, or with a piece of God's blood he made him. Not in the likeness of God he made him. Furthermore, to emphasize his divine status, the Hebrew Genesis quoted God addressing Adam in line 3:22, saying, "Adam had become as one of us," just before he was offered to eat from the tree of life to acquire the long life of a typical God living for a millennium. Below is an original reading by the author from the Hebrew Genesis, lines 1:26, 3:22, and 5:1 respectively. "And God said, Let us make humans in our own image, as a piece of our blood, and let them benefit by the fish of the sea, and by the fowl of the air, and by the cattle, and by all the earth, and by every creeping thing that is creeping upon the earth. And God created the humans in his own characteristic. In the characteristic of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God Almighty said, Here, Adam has become as one of us, calling for good evil. And he even may put forth his hand. And he, Adam, took part of the tree of life, and ate, and lived for long." This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day God created Adam, with a piece of God's blood, he made him. Male and female he created them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day of their creation. The Quran, on the other hand, did not offer any details or comment regarding Adam's age, blood type, look, or immortality status. According to the Quran, the first human was formed from clay or mud, but he was also created from alaq, an old Arabic word meaning blood. The Quran further said that this human was formed from clay and blood first, but he was given an image afterwards. By saying he was given an image, but avoiding any further details about that image or the blood type, the Quran was simply being consistent with a central teaching in Islam. The look and nature of God is unknown to us, and one should not even speculate about it. However, and despite his classification as the first prophet by Muslim scholars, there is no single reference in the Quran explicitly referring to Adam as a prophet. He was only referred to as being a chosen one, along with Noah and a couple more prophets and their immediate sons. And that was interpreted as being a prophet. On the contrary, the Quran gave Adam a godly status by saying he was created from the mud, but was then filled with the spirit or soul of God. The Quran even emphasized this status by stating God had asked all divine characters of heaven to prostrate to him, a worship act reserved for gods, not the prophets. By substituting God's blood with God's spirit, the Quran reaffirmed Adam as a creature of godly characteristics, consistent with how the Hebrew Genesis described him, rather than a common human. According to the Quran, only Jesus was created in an arguably similar process as Adam, with a divine spirit below and without two parents. Aside from the Quran, most early Muslim scholars believed Adam was a giant, living for millennium. In other words, he was not a normal human. The immortality status of Adam and the event surrounding his desire to attain it mark the additional two central elements of his monotheist story. The premise of the first element was that his disobedience of God, even if unintended or caused by misinformation, was the reason behind human mortality. In both the Hebrew Genesis and the Quran, Adam risked his eternal life because he defied the God after becoming a victim of deception, but he was forgiven afterwards. However, following his forgiveness in Genesis, Adam was given a very long life, rather than the eternal life he was seeking when he ate from the forbidden tree. God invited him to eat from the tree of life, to live a long life, not eternal life. The Hebrew word blah in line 322 means for a very long, not forever, as most current translations claim. In the Quran, the topic of Adam's age was left open, allowing Muslim scholars to speculate that he had lived the age claimed by Genesis without offering any details. The Hebrew Genesis further detailed how the later human generations lost their ability to attain a very long life, and why their age was limited to 120 years. It explained that because many of the sons of God mated with many pretty human daughters and had mixed children, the God became angry seeing his soul being attached to too many partial humans. Genesis's explanation, of course, openly contradicted the concept of one God, which monotheism routinely prides itself for pioneering, since the sons of God were gods, as the following reader by the author of lines 6:1-3 clearly suggests. And because the society of humans became huge on the crust of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God sheltered the daughters of the humans because they were beautiful, and they took as women for them, meaning marriage, whomever they wanted. And the Almighty said, "My soul shall not abide for long in a human, in a mischievous. He is flesh." And his days since were 120 years. The events surrounding Adam's loss of mortality marked the second key element of the story of Adam, where he is depicted as a victim of an evil character plotting to hurt him and/or end humanity. The conflict between good and evil is the main theme here. Both Genesis and Quran explain how that evil character deceived Adam and his wife to disobey God's order to bring punishment upon him. While Genesis represented this character by a satanic serpent, the Quran identified it as Iblis, i.e. Satan, and explained he is a jinn, or a ghost, who was once among God's divine characters but was later expelled from heaven because he defied God by refusing to prostrate to Adam. According to the Quran, Satan was the father of all jinns, and Adam was the father of all humans. Muslims believe Satan, al-Shaitan, was formed from fire, unlike Adam, who was formed from clay. It is important to observe here that in the monotheist story of Adam, the conflict was initially between Satan as the force of evil and the God as the force of good, not between Satan and Adam. Adam was a victim first. Only after the God said, "Adam has become as one of us," that Adam started to take the role of a messenger or force for good, like the God, as we saw earlier when reading the line 3:22 of Genesis. Undoubtedly, the story of Adam must have been substantially based, at least partially, on several previously circulating folk stories involving its main characters and key events. From the greater Mesopotamia region, which includes most of the Fertile Crescent today, observing the main elements of the story and examining the key functionalities and name meanings of its main characters should easily reveal their actual attested identities. A name of a character can change significantly over the millennium since it is only a nickname, but its characteristics and roles only evolve slightly into different ones to fit the religious and geopolitical desires in various historical time periods. A good example is Satan, which the Quran called Iblis or al-Shaitan. He is without the slightest doubt Enlil of Mesopotamia himself, who was also known as Amuri and Elil. A straightforward analysis of all his nicknames and his key roles revealed he was the lord of jinns, ghosts, in ancient Mesopotamia, a creator of storms and chaos, an angry stubborn god who threatens and blusters, an instigator of jealousy and hate and skepticism, and a desperate, crazy, fool devil. These are the characteristics of Satan after he was expelled from heaven, according to the narrative of the Quran. In fact, the story of the flood in the standard Babylonian edition in the Epic of Gilgamesh clearly revealed his roles as such, as the following reading by the author of lines 157-206 from Tablet 11 show below. Notice the evil role played by Enlil and his attempt to annihilate humanity by the flood. Through an eyewitness account told by Utanapistim, Noah, to Gilgamesh, describing what he saw and heard immediately after leaving the raft ship at the top of Mount Nimus, also Mount Nisr. Anyway, so it goes on and talks a lot about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we see how it goes through various stories. And, Adam is a character that exists in other stories, but the names change. And he argues that it parallels kind of these stories that are in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Quran, or these other things. And we see that, very interestingly, God tells everyone to worship Adam, to prostrate themselves to Adam, and Satan refuses. And for this he is cast out. God says that Adam has become as one of us. And there's this idea of that Adam was not created just out of the mud, but was created by the blood of a god. That's very reminiscent of us being children of God. We are, his seed, we are his blood, his kin. Anyway, I'm going to skip forward a bit. It says, the conflict of good and evil in the flood story of the standard Babylonian edition of the Gilgamesh epic was between two Mesopotamian gods, Enlil and Idim, who was called Ea later on, the creator of the first human, according to the Babylonian creation epic, as shall be seen later. This human creator god versus human destroyer god conflict is identical to the conflict seen in the monotheist story of Adam between the creator god and Satan. For the sake of identifying characters, it should not make a difference whether it was about annihilating humans by eliminating Adam or Noah. Looking at the two characters abstractly, Noah was Adam too. The monotheist story of Adam simply replaced the human creator, Idim, with the supreme god of the heavens, Anu or Alu, also called Anum, Anim, or Alum, which the Hebrew Genesis called Alahim, adding the final Arabic letter Mim for emphasis, and the Quran called Allah. This is expected since monotheism is about one supreme God. The god Idim became Adam and was simply downgraded to a superhuman of godly status in the reluctant Hebrew Genesis. A millennium later, the god Idim became Adam and was simply downgraded. The more assertive Quran only identified him as the father of humans without calling him God or prophet, but it hinted to his super-divine status as someone who other divine characters of heaven were required to prostrate to. Today, Adam is identified by most Muslim scholars as a prophet and is given the same long godly age claimed in Hebrew Genesis. Additionally, it is very important to observe here that the names Adam and Idim are linguistically correlated. The gods Enlil and Idim were not the only gods keeping their divine roles under monotheism. In addition to the one supreme god of heavens, Anu or Alu, two important groups of gods working collectively but separately to serve the gods also did. One of them was the Anunnaki group, comprising of good soldier gods working under the command of Anu, both on earth and in heaven. The other one was the Igigi group, working under the command of Enlil. This group initially comprised of good gods living in heaven and working with the Anunnaki to help Anu, just as Enlil was, but eventually most of them became bad gods following Enlil's steps and living underground. This was evident in their role as the soldiers of Enlil in the Gilgamesh epic flood story. In an almost identical fashion, Genesis and the Quran spoke about God's angels working in close proximity to God as a group. They spoke about the underground characters of Gog and Magog. In the Quran, they were called Yajuj and Majuj. One of God's angels, Jibrail, was eventually the one revealing the words of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. The Quran also spoke about good and bad underground jinns as the generations of Iblis. It is quite clear from their identical roles and characteristics that the Mesopotamian Anunnaki gods simply became the angels of God, and the Igigi gods became the jinns, or the Gog and Magog, under the new monotheistic order. Again, this was necessary to introduce this new one God concept. Once again, as with Adam, the names Gog, Magog, and Igigi are linguistically correlated. At present, we do not have a single ancient Mesopotamian story with all the details of the Hebrew Genesis story of Adam, but we do know about several earlier stories, including important bits and pieces from that story. Anyway, most stories should have some degree of originality, even when they are similar to previous ones, and Adam's Hebrew story should not be an exception. Many scholars attempted to link the Adam story directly to specific earlier Mesopotamian stories. Horpel thinks that it was a Canaanite story originally, citing another story with similar characters and events, which was discovered a few years ago on several Ugaritic cuneiform tablets from the late 13th century BC. The main god in that story was El, and was supposedly living on Mount Ararat, otherwise known as the mountain where Noah settled according to the Hebrew Genesis and possibly the Gilgamesh epic. At some point, God El expelled an evil god named Harun because he wanted to replace him, and in revenge, Harun transformed the tree of life to a tree of death and enveloped the whole world in a poisonous fog. God El then dispatched a good god named Adam, who was dependent on the tree of life to maintain his immortality so that he would fight Harun to restore the tree back. However, Harun transformed himself into a serpent and bit Adam, making him mortal forever. Eventually, Harun uprooted the tree of death after he was forced by the gods, and the goddess of Sun sent Adam, a good woman, to start the process of human reproduction. Unfortunately, I was not able to personally examine the transliterations of the Ugaritic tablets that were used by Horpel, but I am confident her overall translation and story outline are accurate. I also think her speculation of a linkage between that story and the story of Adam is very valid. The main elements of the Ugaritic and Genesis stories are identical. The conflict was between God and Satan, with Adam being a victim, and Harun's goal was to hurt or eliminate Adam. The characters involved were almost identical in names: the Tree of Life, Hillel, i.e. the serpent, El, Alu, Alim, or Allah, Adam, and Harun, aka Satan. The name Harun was clearly another nickname of Satan, aka Enlil, likely pronounced Harun, and was derived from the Arabic word hrn, which means the stubborn or the unruly. The word Hillel or Hilal is derived from Arabic root word hll, which means male serpent, among many other meanings. The most significant fact attested by the Ugaritic story is that the main characters, Adam and Satan, were indeed gods, just as concluded in this study. Also, this story clearly corroborated several unique details from the story of Adam in Genesis and the Quran, and indicated that the Quran must have had additional sources other than Genesis. Still, this Ugaritic story does not seem to be the direct source of the monotheistic story of Adam, because the events of the two stories are significantly different. Rather, these stories must have independently referenced various earlier Mesopotamian-based mythological stories involving the gods Anu, Idim, and Enlil. I'm going to skip forward some more. Skipping forward, there were many ancient Mesopotamian gods, called by many different names, but only one supreme god, the god of the heavens, who was called only by one name, Anu or Alu, sometimes Anum, Anim, or Alum, after adding the optional M for emphasis. In Akkadian, the sounds for N and L were often interchangeable. Since the cuneiform tablets for Anu was the same as the word for Alu, for God, many times his name was not preceded by the usual Digir sign for deity, as was the case for all other gods. Over the millenniums, many new Mesopotamian gods were born, and many old ones died or faded. Some gods were regional ones, while others, like Idim and Enlil, were more universal, even when they were called by different nicknames. Mesopotamian gods behaved like humans in terms of aging, emotion, revenge, morality, and even sexual desires. They had wives, sons, and daughters. They were male and female. This is why the Hebrew Genesis claim that Adam was formed in the image and blood of God is not a strange or surprising claim. In fact, the ancient Babylonian creation epic, also referred to as Enuma Elis, was primarily a creation epic of the Mesopotamian gods. First few lines in the tablets describe the creation of the first human and earth prior to the emergence of the gods. But most of the lines were about the struggles between the gods and the emergence of the grandson of Anu, Marduk, the powerful future god of Babylonia, who had supposedly created the heavens and placed his grandfather Anu there, as we shall see later. Below is an excerpt reading by the author from the Babylonian creation epic, detailing the events surrounding the creation of the early Mesopotamian gods, the key characters prior to their creation, the crowning of Anu's son, Ea, aka Idim. Anyway, I guess I could read that, but it looks really hard to read, so I'm not going to read that. Anyway, this article is a little hard to read. It's got a lot of names, but you're getting the idea, and it's the idea that Adam was originally a god in ancient Mesopotamian mythology and mythologies of the surrounding area, but over time he got demoted. And why did he get demoted? He got demoted because of this monotheistic reform of the Bible, and that's the Bible that we have today. And when you read the King Follett Discourse, this is what Joseph Smith talks about. He says that the first line of the Bible was changed by some old Hebrew guy, and he changed it, whereas it used to say, in the beginning, the gods created the heaven and the earth. And this is like a very controversial thing, and the monotheists, they will shriek and holler about how Im is just for emphasis, and I think I've talked about Michael Heiser before, but the biblical scholarship, which we can trust them or not, I like to trust them in so much as they are useful for me making a point. Anyway, so Michael Heiser and some of these other scholars, they're coming to realize that the world of the Old Testament is not a monotheistic world. It has simply been crammed into a monotheistic interpretation. And this is extremely funny to watch them do like mental gymnastics to try and preserve their character and identity of who they are as, Bible Belt Christians when you watch these documentaries about it. Anyway, very funny. There's this whole idea of like the sons of God marrying the daughters of man, and how that created problems. It created the Nephilim. And I've heard these people go on and on about how this is not about there being lots of gods. This is all just a denunciation of polygamy, and that's why Mormonism is fake. It's just extremely funny to listen to them. But anyway, you should read this paper. It's extremely interesting. So we'll read the conclusion. But he says, in conclusion, the first monotheistic human, Adam, was originally a god. In the Mesopotamian mythology, just as the Hebrew Genesis reluctantly revealed, and the assertive Quran slightly hinted, specifically, he was the pre-monotheistic Sumerian god Idim, who is also called Ea, and many other nicknames over the millenniums. The names Idim and Adam are even linguistically related, according to early Arabic root word analysis. As a Mesopotamian god, Idim was the creator of the first human, and the father of his immediate generations. He was sometimes referred to in the ancient literature. He was the preserver of life on earth, and the protector of humans against the evil designs of their and his archenemy, Enlil, the future monotheist Satan. The names and roles of these two important divine characters, Idim and Enlil, were etched too deep in the collective folk memory of the peoples of the greater Mesopotamia and the Near East to be completely erased by the new monotheist order. The early monotheists had likely eased in their new beliefs to the peoples of the region by incorporating these two second highest ranking gods under the supreme god of heavens, Anu or Alu, as new altered divine characters. The top god, Anu, was then given the post-monotheist role of the one and only God, Alhim or Allah, consistent with the key theme of the monotheist faiths. Several important narrative details involving the events, characters, and roles of the Hebrew Genesis story of Adam must have predated it for many centuries. The story in the Quran omitted much of the details of Genesis, but included a few unique details on its own. However, all of these ancient stories seem to be independent, original stories, borrowing only bits and pieces from each other. And that is an extremely interesting paper. I think there is an even longer one if you want to read a paper that every time it mentions a character it lists 10 names that you can't pronounce, and there is a hailstorm going on, so the audio is probably going to be a little messed up. But we don't care, because we are going to continue posting whether or not weather permits. But anyway, it just comes down to this idea of there being an ancient original religion. And this ancient original religion seems to be hinted at in this paper. The idea of Mesopotamia, which is the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of civilization. We all learned about it in 5th grade. The religion of these people, it's possible, according to this Arabic guy, that Adam was originally a character called Ea, or Idim, and he was the god who created man, and the father of, he's their ancestor, right? He's created from the blood of a god. As we learn about the endowment, we learn about what Joseph taught in the King Follett Discourse. Statements like Adam or Michael is the Ancient of Days. What exactly was Joseph hinting at when he said, people are so stubborn, and if you try and tell them the truth, they'll all fly to pieces and they'll have a come apart? What is he getting at? And so the idea of this ancient original religion from which all other religions originate is a very powerful idea. And we see it with cataclysmic myths like the flood being seen cross-culturally. There's other things that seem to hint at it with, Peru and mummies in Egypt, and these mummies all over the place. They have blonde hair. I think that the Aryan invasion theory has been confirmed as real as far as the history of India goes. When we learn about Joseph Smith and how he was talking about the Adamic language, he would call out these other religions who do this kind of glossolalia babbling stuff. I was listening to one of his talks called Test the Spirits, and it's a very interesting talk, but he calls that out. At the same time, he believed in the Adamic language, and if I recall correctly, he did say that the German language was closest to it, which I don't know what the Adamic language is, but the Germanic language, to my understanding, is the closest language to Proto-Indo-European. There's this idea that Adam was, a perfect man, that he was a giant. That's what the Muslims were saying, and some of the early saints, when they had visions, they had a vision of Adam and Eve, and they describe him as a giant, perfect man. And I think that everyone on earth has inherited attributes from this original first perfect man. And anyway, so that's why I think that these kind of Graham Hancock types who talk about ancient civilizations and the existence of high civilization in the past are very interesting, especially when we talk about an ancient original religion. Where do all these things come from? We talk a lot about evolution, but I don't know if we can really believe in human evolution as Mormons. I think what we need to believe in is human devolution. That the further we get away from the beginning, the more corrupted we have become. We've talked about some of Heber C. Kimball's comments about clay, because he was a potter, and how they relate to reincarnation. But he also made similar comments about clay when it comes to the creation of the earth. And he taught that Joseph Smith had taught him that this earth was made out of the parts of previous earths. And, you could think of that as, worlds were smashed up into pieces and were squished into a new ball in the same way you would make a ball of clay. But when talking about this, they talk about how the earth is clearly older than what the Bible says. And that was how they were coming to terms with that. And that is the idea of an old earth, that earth is far older than the biblical account would suggest. Maybe the idea of the earth being smashed up and reformed into a new ball out of other earths is a bit fantastic for our modern brains, but I think that the idea that we live in the ruins of previously existing high civilizations on this earth who existed, hundreds of thousands of years ago resonates a lot. I think I've mentioned before that in this book of Forbidden Archaeology, they have found anatomically modern fossilized footprints where they shouldn't be, under lava flows or whatever that carbon date super old. And it kind of negates the idea that these kind of Sasquatchy looking skeletons that we dig up, that those are our ancestors. Maybe they aren't our ancestors. Maybe they are simply just something else. Others have talked about how it's interesting that, Odin in some of these Norse mythologies or Nordic mythologies, that Odin dies on a tree with a spear wound in his side, and how that kind of hints to the idea of an ancient original religion. And maybe that's just because the Nordic mythology as it exists today has been contaminated by Christian ideas. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, so those are some thoughts about the idea of an old Earth that we, almost like in the Matrix, how the world has been through many iterations on the same program. I'm not 100% opposed to the idea of a 7,000-year-old Earth with some caveats, and that would be, what exactly does it mean to create an Earth? I could believe that 7,000 years ago the Earth came into existence, but to create an Earth without a history, did you really create it? Like if I was going to create an animal, say I had that power to create an animal, well, can I create it without parents? Can I create, did I really create a real animal if it doesn't have parents? Well, if those parents don't have parents, is it a real animal, And so the idea of creating something without a history doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And so the idea that, since the Earth is only 7,000 years old, it's impossible to find something that's 10,000 years old on the Earth doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Skyrim is a world that was created, but within the world of Skyrim, there is lore. There's the previous games that are hinted at. There's ruins in the game, all these ancient Nordic ruins in the game. But all of those ruins were created by the developers to give the world a history, to give the world meaning and purpose and a backstory. And without a backstory, is it really even a world? And so those are my thoughts on young Earth creationism, that the Earth could be 1 second year old. There's that idea that the past doesn't even exist. Everything could have started 10 seconds ago, and your memories are fake, and this is all a simulation. Whoa, bro, it's like a simulation. They do have a point. I mean, they need to put down the smoke, but they do have a point when they talk about that. And so these very hard-nosed interpretations of young Earth creationism and what that means and how that means that Earth cannot have any history that is older than 7,000 years old, it really doesn't make sense to me. So the Earth could be 7,000 years old, it could be 200,000, it could be billions of years old. Either of those could be true, and I feel like the world could still look exactly the same. Just because there's some old rocks doesn't really prove anything to me. So, once you go into the world of the supernatural and gods, it's like none of the rules apply anymore. So, don't stress about it. Stop trying to think about everything so logically. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. I apologize for reading like 4,000 pages and for the rain, but that's what I was in the mood for today. Got different moods every day, so that's what we had. Stay faithful. Have a good one.